John O'Donnell is a Penn employee and has been working for the university for 5 years. He enjoys providing administrative and academic support in the field of healthcare education. John started taking classes through the post-baccalaureate program and after a year transitioned into the MLA. He completed his program this May. The focus of his studies has been sociology and communication. His two favorite classes were cultural communication and body language, along with games and play. Both classes involved research projects and reflections on observational fieldwork. For his capstone project, John expanded on his research on body language to help improve communication between patients and providers. John will now talk to us about decoding anxiety expressed through nonverbal communication as he excerpts findings from his MLA project. Thank you, John.
So I also grew up in Philadelphia. I went to high school right at 17th and Girard, and then after I finished high school, I just was right down the street at Temple University. So in high school, I started my focus with communications and language. We had to all take Latin and French, and I didn't realize at the time, but I found Latin significantly more difficult because we were always just translating, and we were never able to engage or use conversation. And later on, I started to realize that part of what was missing was that body language, that when you're only looking at the translations, you don't get the person's tone, you don't get their posture, and it becomes significantly more easier when you have those additional elements that come into play. So when I was at Temple, I focused on English literature and French language studies. And then in my junior year at Temple, I decided to study abroad. I lived in Strasbourg, France, and I studied at the University of Strasbourg. So Strasbourg is a fairly modern city. It's like the capital of the European Parliament, so it was very developed and advanced, and everyone was very nice there. But it is right on the border with Germany. So even though I'd been studying French for about 8 years at that point, when I first got to that region, I was completely unprepared for the accent, and it almost felt like I was a beginner. So I was relying very heavily on body language and pointing to get around those first few days. And then I kept noticing that you don't need to lose that. So obviously you want to keep improving your language skills, but for those first few days it was almost survival mode, so I was looking very heavily onto the body language, both what I was expressing and what people were giving back to me, and then kind of using that and getting kind of accustomed to the differences, because obviously it's regional. Body language isn't necessarily always universal, there's always going to be variations, so I was learning kind of what was different for that region, and then kind of also using that with my communication. So then I came back to Philadelphia. I finished my studies at Temple in 2006. After I finished at Temple, I started to work in the hospitality industry. I worked at Penn in Philadelphia, so I could still use some of my French language skills. But I think one of the reasons why I enjoyed working there so much and why I was successful was because I started to pick up on those nonverbal cues and signals. So it was one of the 5-star restaurants. It was the only one in the state, and I think when I worked there, it was one of 15 in the country. So it was an area where the expectations were very, very high, and when customers were upset, they really wanted resolution very, very quickly. And I learned quickly that if you're not picking up on why they're upset and how you can improve the situation, they're not going to be satisfied and they're not going to come back. So even though it was slightly outside of my field of study, I kind of was using my field of study to kind of advance myself there. I worked for the restaurant for about 3 years, and then I decided that I kind of wanted to continue my education. So I started looking for different opportunities at the University of Pennsylvania. So I originally applied with the dental school. I applied for a couple different positions, and then when I was interviewed, one of the hiring officers picked up on my background in the service industry and hospitality. So the dental school is right down the street. It serves a very local population, and one of the biggest problems they face is patient retention. So after the cost and different transportation issues, one of the biggest reasons that they found that patients leave was because of breakdowns in communications. So the patient population at the dental school, there's a lot of people that speak English as a second language. They do have a network of international students, and they always try to use that to their advantage. My background, obviously, gave me the opportunity for a few times to serve as a translator. And then in 2010, after the Haiti earthquake, I was part of a task force that was setting up community outreach for refugees in the area. So again, I didn't have that much exposure to Creole French, but I did have a little bit, and I was working with everybody again to kind of help people stay comfortable and kind of help facilitate and translate as best as possible. So right around 2010 is when I started taking classes in the post-bac program. They offered Irish language classes at the university, and it was one of the first times I'd ever seen the chance to take the Irish language in a university setting. So I met Professor Rosalind Blum-LeDrew, and I started taking Irish language classes. And before, I'd really only studied Romance languages, and I was right back to that point of being dependent very heavily back on body language. So when I was working at the dental school, I really only would be able to help patients that would speak French, but after a while, everyone kind of had used me as a go-to person, because even though I might not speak the language of the patient, I was better at kind of listening to them and communicating with them and finding out which language they spoke or how I could help them. So one of the first visits that you come to the dental school for, it's a 3-hour appointment, and it is an admissions appointment. So it's a lot of medical history updates and it's a lot of questions. And when there are those patients that have difficulty with English and you don't have a provider that speaks the same language as the patient, it can make the appointment even longer. And if that first appointment scares them away, they're never really going to finish treatment. So I worked at the dental school for about 4 years, and during that time I started taking classes as part of the MLA program, and I wanted to take classes that would let me work on that communication issue. What could you do to improve communication with the patients and the providers? So I realized pretty quickly that you're not going to have very much control over the patients, but you could work with the providers. So you could work with the students to try to help them communicate better with their patients. I originally was working in the admissions clinic at the school, and then I transferred to more of an advisor position where I was helping students manage their patients, kind of keep the patients that they had and work out with any problem issues that they have with their patients. So then I was getting closer towards the end of my study, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do for my capstone project. My 2 classes, like I said, there was one on games and play, and that was from Professor Anna Barrison, and she was interesting. She kind of had a very interdisciplinary background herself. She originally had a background in dance, then she kind of transitioned after she kind of finished that stage of her life. She went back to school and she actually earned dual PhDs in folklore and psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. So after the games and play class, I took a follow-up class with her, and that was the course on body language and communication. And her focuses are on child development, so we got to see her fieldwork. She goes to different public schools around the area, kind of records the students and looks at how they play and how they develop. So I got to kind of see how she does her fieldwork. And then for my project, I wanted to specifically observe the students and how they interact with their patients to try and improve how they work with their patients. So this is a small quote from Oscar Wilde. It says, "Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth." And one of the things that I've noticed, and a lot of other scholars have noticed, is that we are always trying to change the message that we're using. Part of that is through the words that we use, and the rest is through the body language and the nonverbal communication. So the most important scholar for nonverbal communication is Albert Moravian. You may have heard of him. He deals also from an interdisciplinary approach. He started out at MIT, and he did his undergrad in engineering. He also earned a Master of Science from MIT. And then he switched and went to psychology and started to focus exclusively on nonverbal behavior. So then, for my project, one of the most important things for me was scope. So I knew I wanted to address the issue of communication and specifically look at body language. So for my project, I limited it to hour observations. So I would be kind of the first hour of when the students are treating with their patients, and specifically how they greet the patient, how they sit them in the chair, and then the first step of the appointment, which is taking the medical history. So I was using human subjects, so I did have to go through the IRB, but I wasn't taking any pictures and I wasn't making any recordings besides my own narrative notes, so I didn't need any permission from the patients. And all these pictures are from the dental school's website, so they're not pictures of actual patients. But if you look at that picture in the top right corner, that gives you an idea of how invasive just the typical treatment is at the dental school. So in the middle, you can see the faculty, And then you can see one student that would be the primary person that's treating, and the other student who's helping with the suctioning device that's kind of acting and assisting. So you see how tight this space is, and you see that the patient's almost lost in all those different providers. It's an uncomfortable situation. I mean, any dental appointment or any medical appointment is uncomfortable, but I figured that the dental school would kind of be the perfect place to look at anxiety, just because all of those issues are heightened. The other big takeaway from my observation was, if you notice, while they're treating, you can see that all of the providers have on dental loops or goggles, and they also have on masks. So every time I was making my observations, I would notice that sometimes in order to save time, instead of removing them, the students would leave them on and then actually talk through the masks and the loops to their patients. But if any time if a faculty member came over, they would remove those. So I think they do that in part as a sign of respect to their faculty member, but they also need to realize that the patients can pick up on that, and it is actually impeding their communications. There were several times when I would notice they'd have to repeat themselves or they'd have to ask questions again because the patient just actually couldn't understand them. If you look at the picture in the bottom right corner, that's one of the graduate clinics, and that would be more like the setup at a private practice. So again, you see how the patient there's more space. You can also see how patients relax in the chair, their hands are folded, their legs are crossed, and that would be kind of the ideal situation of how a patient would be when they're not stressed or they're not showing signs of anxiety. One of the times, or the different signs that I kind of identified as a patient who was nervous or upset, is when they're more rigid, when they're not using any of the rests, when their toes point inwards, or anytime they're kind of doing anything unnatural. And that's what the providers can kind of look for to kind of gauge what the level of anxiety is for their patient. One of the things that I enjoyed about the program is that I was able to kind of develop projects that work specifically for issues that were applied to my work, and that was interesting to me, but it was also interesting to my employers. So though earlier I talked about the scholar Albert Mehrabian, he came up with his theory. You may have heard of this before. It gets talked about a lot. It's the 7%, 38%, 55% rule, and kind of gets taken out of context a lot, and he's acknowledged this himself, that people want to kind of simplify it and say that 90% of meaning is contained in tone and body language. He did do a research study. It is credible, but he was specifically looking just at liking. So if it's not a situation where you're asking someone if they like or dislike something, that formula doesn't necessarily apply, but it's easier to remember, and that 90% really jumps out at people, so they'll just throw it around whenever they can. The other major thing that I took away was position of when the students are treating. I did this diagram the best I can. So if you can imagine a patient in the chair, and if you can imagine a provider, they spend most of their time in about the 45 to 180 degree range. So if you can imagine, if you were in kind of the 45 to about the 120 degree range, you'd have some chance of seeing the patient's expression. Once you get to 180 degrees, you really would never be able to see the patient's expression. So, I mean, depending on which area of the mouth they're working on, there are times when they would have to use those different positions, but anytime when they're addressing the patient or if they're taking a medical history, they should really make sure that they're connecting with the patient and they position themselves where that's possible. So I did get to work closely with the students and the faculty, and when I brought this up to the students, one of their first comments was that the way the workstation is, if you can see it, it's the computer terminal on the screen. It's positioned behind the patient. So in order for them to be able to make contact with the patient and be able to enter data, they either need an assistant, which they don't always have, or they constantly have to switch back and forth. So that positioning was just an IT thing. It was easier, it was closer to the outlets, but it's one of the things that they can change, and by moving it up just a little bit, they'll give the students the opportunity to connect with the patient and enter the information at the same time, so they're not losing time and they're still connecting with the patient. So this is just a couple more examples of the different setups. In this first picture, there isn't a patient in the chair, but one of the things that the students do to kind of make the patients feel at ease is they have everything set up, and they're constantly layering things with extra layers of plastic, extra protection, just to kind of make the patient feel at ease. And sometimes they'll have all this stuff set up, and there's probably parts that they're not even going to use, but they still have everything sealed off. And that in part is safety regulations, but sometimes it's just overkill. It's one of the tricks the students use to make their patients feel at ease. So that is one of the good things that they can do. I talked earlier a little bit about masks. So the patients are always masking their kind of anxiety, but then in that setting, you have students that are nervous themselves, they're questioning their own skill sets, and they kind of have to put on their own mask, and they have to be careful of what their body language is. They don't want to seem nervous, and they don't want to always seem to be kind of second-guessing themselves. So having the students focus both on their own body language, what they're sending out, and kind of making sure that they put themselves in a position where they're at least from time to time observing their patient's body language will improve their dynamic with their patients. One of the last things I want to talk about quickly is for a while there was a big shift away from the importance of body language, and I think that had to do with telephone, text, and emails. But more recently, people are seeing with things like Skype and FaceTime and webinars that telepresence is becoming more and more important. I recently switched to the School of Nursing, and they're doing a lot of things with telenursing and also kind of education through where body language will be captured. So I also think that my project will be relevant because I think as that technology advances, there'll be more and more of a focus on kind of that audio-visual body language.
Thanks, John. Does anybody have any questions for John?
Have any of the dental students asked for your feedback on your observations?
So I had worked there with them for 4 years, so a lot of them had knew what I was studying. Then there was a new class, and they were very concerned that I was kind of there to observe their performance. So I met with them individually, and I kept everything anonymous, but I let them see my notes in the first few visits. So that helped them kind of act more natural. And I also wanted to let them know if their patients had any questions of why it was in the clinic, that they could tell them and I could talk to them. So I met with them a few times, and then I'm also working to kind of put a presentation together as a small part of their orientation for the future students that come into clinic.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John. Well, that concludes the presentations for the evening. I think there was really 5 excellent speakers, and we kind of ran the gamut there from personal stories, stories about other cultures, stories about pain and anxiety in the dentist's office, and I don't know, not much pain and anxiety, although a little bit of each in the wedding industry too, so one never knows. So I hope that you enjoyed hearing from these 5 presenters. They really did great work, and I'm glad you could join us this evening. We do have some food outside still left over for the reception, so if you'd like to come out and join us and chit-chat afterwards, that would be great. Thanks very much for coming.